Hi friends, my name is ssuuuper, Coach Talk with People. I want to make a quick video about mechanism. It's pretty frustrating, that life journey I just went through, trying to explain to people how, without an understanding of a mechanism, you don't have an understanding. So, if you're going to try to make claims like, say, the WEF, the World Economic Foundation, or whatever, has got some nefarious plans of how to exploit COVID in some ways to take a new world order, there needs at some point in your thinking to be an analysis of mechanisms. So, if in fact this WEF is a unique threat to this new world order thing, regarding this new world order thing, um, and significant, then before you're going to conclude that, you asked and answered the following questions. You said, what is the mechanism by which this organization is going to exercise control over those individual parties and sovereignties, be they governments or individuals or corporations or whatever? How is it going to execute those controls? So, in other words, what controls does it want to execute, and how will it execute them? If your reasoning is something like, well, they want to get rid of sovereign nation governments and have one world government or something, then what is the mechanism by which they're going to get the populations of these various sovereign nations and or the leaders to hand over sovereignty to this central organization? Now, they can't include everybody as part of the top level decision making team. So you're getting people who are currently top level decision makers to choose to hand over their fiefdom of authority to somebody else. What's the mechanism by which this is being accomplished? In other words, why is it the case if in fact Western world leaders and stuff are all on board with some central new world order, one government thing, then what does that mean operationally? In other words, does it mean that world leaders have committed publicly on some sort of treaty or something to a given course of action, and that there is some sort of mechanism to enforce compliance with what they've agreed to do? Does it mean that there's a military force that is going to occupy something? Does it mean, in other words, just because some organization is opposed to nationalism and thinks that there should be international law and there should be less national sovereignty because the worst manifestations of national sovereignty are very bad, and they think somehow that international sovereignty will solve this. There are certainly bodies, various government organizations, and individuals who think this, and there's no doubt about that. And they fund projects that work towards that goal, probably. Okay? But what happens when people use NI instead of TI or NE, or forget the cognitive functions, but just what happens is frustrating, is people think that they can know that something nefarious is going on without concurrently knowing that there's millions and millions and millions of nefarious things going on, all in contradiction or in confluence or in competition with that one that you've identified there. And this is true from the biggest level organizations to the smallest level individuals. That they all have interests, agency, and some amount of unpredictability. So, if you're going to highlight a certain organization as being a particular threat, such as the WEF, which is the World Economic Foundation, then you'd want to articulate something specific. I got, as response to some of the things I was asking about it, they've gotten all the Western leaders on board. Well, what does that mean? Did the Western leaders agree to do anything? What does, agree in principle that we're on the same page. Okay. And how much is that worth? Nothing, right? So the thing is, there are a lot of various organizations, some shady, some totally innocent, that think that their vision of the world is correct and want to impose it on everybody else. And sometimes singular instances of those kinds of things will rise to actually gain permanency. And we'll see that happen in peaceful times as certain countries swing this way, that way in terms of what they're doing and whose vision they're implementing more of, to the extent that there's shifting power on a shorter term scale. And on a longer term scale, we see society as a whole continually repeating the same patterns about different things. But this time, we have the internet. So humans have always imagined nefarious theys with puppet mastery kind of tricks and stuff behind the scenes, making this stuff happen, whatever it is. And in this case, it's some of the spookier, weirder stuff about COVID. It is the case that COVID has displayed an unusually large amount of censorship or information control in ways that are kind of spooky and would indicate like maybe there's some organization behind this or something. But there are better explanations, because it's better to not have an explanation. If you're trying to find out who's to blame for this, where's the motive, who benefits, then you're not getting the kind of problem that we're talking about. So, in a situation like COVID, where we've had this massive shutdown of the world and lockdowns and all these authoritarian measures, all in the name of protecting people from what in its most current variant is a very low threat, right, in terms of fatality or anything, and taking measures that are not proportional with the measures we take for other health-related matters in a way that makes any sense at all. So there's not any particular reason why we should be devoting anywhere close to as many resources as we are to this particular cause of potential harm or death, because there are countless possible causes of potential harm and death that would be more responsive to the direction of those same resources and would produce better overall results. So we can't justify it with an impacts claim, basically, because we have to factor in opportunity cost. And this is not even beginning with the Rice calculus, okay? Which is its own reason why we should not affirm, and why we need to understand this whole thing through a different paradigm. It's not that people necessarily have a natural right to anything or whatever, and it's not necessarily even the case that people have a right to be contagiously sick in public and know it. But we do have to understand that people get sick sometimes, and that the reason people get sick is because other people get sick and people hang out with each other. And it's at this point it seems like we've gotten down to where it's like, well, let's try to make it such that nobody hangs out with each other until after we can make COVID go away. But it's like that's never going to happen. It needs to run its course, and that means, and all these control mechanisms have been failing and continue to fail this whole time. In other words, to the extent that they prevent the spread of the illness because of the long incubation time, it's almost impossible to ever get it to not go back up again when you stop taking those active control measures. So the reason that we haven't historically ever responded like this to this kind of thing is because there's a reasonability that says people do get sick, people do die, and something needs to be a exponentially greater threat than, say, your flus or colds for us to take measures that control other people and their daily business, right? So these things are all fair and reasonable. The problem is when we don't focus instead of what we ought to allow public officials authority over, but instead on the WEF, we are harming the cause of truth, justice, and the American way. when instead of focusing on whether or not this business should be forced to force its customers to put on masks, we should be talking about that. We shouldn't be talking about the WEF. Okay? Now, if we wanted to explain why all this is happening, we would say it's a confluence of many, many factors, for sure. And it's not any singular agenda gaining prominence and being pushed through by a single organization. It's agreement by a lot of parties who have partnerships in the production of media objects. So, your mainstream media, okay? Those news outlets have a vested interest in being legitimate and objective in ways that less legitimate and objective voices are not. And so, as a consequence, you're going to see a heavy weighting on the side of health data stuff. In other words, they're going to be objective about it, and they're going to look to World Health Organization officials for cues. But they're not going to actually do the research themselves and figure out what's correct, because that's not their job. Their job is to report on the World Health Organization people telling us what to think about this science-y stuff. So, what you end up seeing is a bunch of organizations fighting very hard, it would seem, to advocate in favor of a certain agenda regarding COVID, and to actively oppose and even sometimes censor or quiet voices that present dissenting narratives. So it is weird that it ran as out of control as it did, and that everybody freaked out as much as they did. I couldn't believe it. Right at the very beginning, I made some predictions that turned out horribly wrong, which were, one, that no way they're going to cancel March Madness. That's crazy. Why would they cancel March Madness for a viral infection that probably we're all going to get anyway, and we just need to let it run its course? Why would we treat this so differently? Just because it's more contagious or something in terms of the fatality rates, they're not going to do that. It's something that crazy. Well, it turned out that they did. Everybody freaked out that much. The rate of alarmism was greater than the capacity to listen. And if people had the capacity to listen, then they would have, hopefully, sought out the voice that was correct, most correct. And those voices were not prescribing action. They were saying, stop, that's an appeal to ignorance. Nope, those are, stop. Let's not shut shit down or do things until we've discussed and figured out what's appropriate given this context and done all the framework, right? But of course, nobody did that because that's not how the world operates. So that's fine. It's not how the world operates. But let me point something out. Again, even if somehow this is part of a shadowy agenda, the WEF is behind this or something, well, they've got you right where they want you, talking about them instead of anything that can possibly impact public policy meaningfully. Because unless you've established a mechanism by which the WEF can impact public policy, then there's no reason to think they can. Since you can't establish such a mechanism, and never will be able to because this is all just speculative NI nonsense, that's what makes it unfortunate. It's like we've got these people around the channel who want to argue with me so much about this kind of stuff, and yet will not hear me about it. What I'm saying is, we have in front of us a serious public policy matter, and you're treating it as though we don't have to ever think about public policy matters anymore, because after all, we've got a very vaguely defined but definitely responsible, shadowy, secret, evil organization to blame. So we don't have to think like adults anymore. We don't talk about public policy. We just end up talking about how that shadowy organization is to blame and how awful they are. And you don't get it, Eric. What about this and this and this? Why are we talking about that? Because, I know who to blame for public policies I don't like. My elected officials, my local city government officials, county officials, things like that, right? This is called reality. So, do your thing, whatever, believe what you're going to believe, but the horse mumbler, shame on you for that shit, that string there at the end. What are you talking about?